Colette's breath plumed in the frigid air, each gasp a testament to her desperate flight. Behind her lay the suffocating comfort of a life she never chose a future, sealed by a loveless arranged marriage to a man whose cruelty was as legendary as his wealth. Ahead, the treacherous, snow-choked peaks of the Rocky Mountains promised a different kind of death, one she would face on her own terms. But the wilderness guards its own secrets, and in its unforgiving heart, she would trade one captor for another. A warrior whose ferocity was whispered in the winds. A man whose tribe held her fate in their hands. This is the story of a woman who fled the gilded cage, only to be snared in the raw, untamed heart of the American West. The flickering gaslights of the Caldwell mansion cast long, dancing shadows across the opulent parlor. They writhed on the flocked wallpaper and twisted across the heavy damask curtains, making the room feel more like a scheme than a sanctuary. From her seat on the stiff velvet settee, Colette Caldwell watched the last vestiges of daylight surrender to the encroaching Montana darkness. The sun bled out behind the sharp peaks in the distance, a daily, silent death that mirrored the slow extinguishing of her own spirit. Her father, Silas Caldwell, a man whose ambition was as vast and unforgiving as the territory he sought to conquer, paced before the grand marble fireplace. His boots, polished to a mirror shine, sank into the plush Aubusson carpet with each heavy, impatient step. His face, usually a mask of stern, calculating authority, was tonight alight with a triumphant gleam that sent a chill colder than any winter wind down Colette's spine. He was a man who saw the world as a chessboard, and he was about to make his queen-sacrificing move. "He'll be here any moment," Colette Silas announced, his voice booming with a false, booming heartiness that grated on her nerves. He paused to adjust a silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a portrait of a younger, happier family that felt like a relic from another lifetime. Jedediah Kane, a man of considerable means, I assure you. His mining operations are the most profitable in the territory. This union, this alliance, will solidify our family's position for generations to come. Jedediah Kane. The name tasted like ash and bile in her mouth. He was a man carved from the same rough, unyielding stone as the mountains that loomed over their burgeoning town of Three Forks. At 45, he was more than twice her age, with a portly build that spoke of overindulgence and a reputation for a temper as volatile as a flash flood. Whispers followed him, like his own shadow stories of ruthless business dealings, of men broken and families ruined, of a cruelty that was legendary among the townsfolk who both feared and envied him. And he, this coarse and brutal man, was to be her husband. Colette's hands, hidden in the voluminous folds of her silken gown, clenched into tight, bloodless fists. Her carefully manicured nails dug into her palms, the small, sharp points of pain, a welcome, grounding distraction from the suffocating despair that threatened to consume her. For weeks she had pleaded, begged, and reasoned with her father. She had appealed to the memory of the man who once read her fairy tales, the father who had taught her to ride. But that man was long gone, replaced by this cold-eyed strategist. Her words had been like pebbles thrown against a fortress wall. Silas Caldwell was not a man to be swayed by a daughter's tears. He saw her not as his child, but as a beautiful, well-bred asset to be leveraged for a strategic advantage. Her mother, Eleanor, offered no sanctuary. She sat in a high-backed chair near the window, her needlepoint lying untouched in her lap. Long ago, she had faded into the background of their tumultuous household, a ghost haunting the opulent rooms her husband had built. Her eyes, once the same vibrant blue as Colette's, were now perpetually downcast, her spirit as brittle as a dried leaf. She had learned the hard way that to defy Silas was to invite his wrath, a wrath that was not loud and explosive, but cold, silent, and cutting as a winter wind. She had tried to speak for Colette once, and the week of icy silence that followed had broken her. Now she offered only resigned platitudes. "It is a woman's duty, Colette. You will have a comfortable life." Comfort was a cold substitute for happiness. The crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive announced the arrival of her future husband. A knot of pure ice formed in Colette's stomach. The maid, a young Irish girl named Maeve, scurried to the door. Soon Colette would be formally presented to him, a lamb to the slaughter. The thought of his thick sausage-like fingers on her hand, his whiskey-sour breath, his possessive gaze roaming over her, was a violation she could not, would not endure. Jedediah Kane filled the doorway, a bullish man draped in a fine wool coat that couldn't quite conceal the brutish power of his frame. His face was florid, his eyes small and shrewd, set deep within fleshy pockets. He held a bouquet of hothouse roses, their vibrant red a jarring slash of color in the muted parlor. They looked as out of place as he did. "Silas, my good man." Kane's voice was a gravelly boom. He handed the flowers to Maeve, without a glance, his eyes immediately locking on to Colette. He advanced on her, his gaze stripping her bare. "And this must be the lovely Miss Caldwell. More beautiful even than the rumors, my dear." Colette forced herself to stand to offer a cool, polite curtsy. "Mr. Kane." The dinner was an agonizing ordeal. Kane dominated the conversation, his voice filling every corner of the dining room, as he boasted of a new silver strike of a land deal that had cheated the railroad of the way he'd handled a union dispute at his mine. He ate with a gluttonous ferocity, wine staining his lips and shirt front. He directed leering compliments at Colette, praising her fine breeding and delicate features as if she were a prize mare he was purchasing. He spoke of their future, of the grand house he would build for her, of the children she would bear him, strong sons to carry on his name. Each word was a nail in her coffin. Her father laughed and poured more wine, basking in the success of his transaction. Her mother picked at her food, her silence a deafening testament to her surrender. Colette felt utterly terrifyingly alone. It was during dessert, a rich chocolate torte, that Kane reached across the table and placed his heavy, warm hand over hers. His touch was damp and possessive. "We shall be very happy, you and I," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in a way that made her skin crawl. "I will give you everything a woman could ever desire." In that moment, under the suffocating weight of his touch and the triumphant gaze of her father, Colette's despair crystallized into cold, hard resolve. She would not be a sacrifice on the altar of her father's ambition. She would not be a bird in a gilded cage, her spirit slowly withering away until she became as silent and broken as her mother. She would fly, or she would die trying. Later that night, long after the mansion had fallen silent and the stench of Kane's cigar smoke had finally faded, Colette made her move. She had been planning this for weeks, ever since the engagement was first announced. It had started as a fantasy, a desperate daydream, but had slowly become a concrete, meticulous plan. She had been secretly stashing supplies: a small oilskin sack of dried beef, a handful of hard-tack biscuits pilfered from the pantry, a full flask of water, and a small but lethally sharp hunting knife she had taken from her father's study. She'd also secreted away a small pouch of coins and her mother's pearl earrings, a painful but necessary theft. She dressed not in silks, but in her sturdiest riding clothes, pulling on woolen trousers she'd bought from the town's tailor under the guise of a gift for a cousin. Her movements were swift and silent in the pre-dawn stillness. In her room, which felt more like a beautifully appointed prison cell, she left a note on her pillow. It was a simple, defiant message for her father, the ink slightly smeared by a single errant tear. She refused to let fall. I choose my own destiny. Do not follow me. Slipping out of the house was easier than she'd imagined. The servants slept soundly in their attic rooms. She moved through the familiar halls like a wraith, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silent darkness. She made her way to the stables, the crisp, cold air of the Montana night, a shocking, welcome slap to her senses. Her beloved mare, a spirited Appaloosa named Willow, nickered softly as she approached, her warm breath misting in the lantern light. Colette soothed the horse with a gentle hand and whispered words, her touch a silent promise of the freedom they would find together. With practiced ease, she saddled Willow, her movements economical and precise. Every second counted. She knew her father's fury upon discovering her gone would be a force of nature. He would not be deterred by her note. His pride and canes would demand a pursuit. She led Willow out of the stables and into the moon-drenched landscape. The icy, jagged peaks of the Bridger Mountains loomed in the distance, a formidable and unforgiving barrier. They were a wall of stone and ice, a place where people perished. But to Colette, they represented the only hope she had. They were her only path to a life she could call her own, a treacherous and uncertain road she was willing to take to escape the certain misery of a life with Jedediah Kane. As she mounted Willow and urged her into a gallop away from the manicured lawns and the suffocating opulence the wind whipped at her hair, a wild and liberating caress. For the first time in years, Colette felt a flicker of something akin to joy. She was no longer a pawn in her father's game. She was a woman on the run, a fugitive in the vast, untamed wilderness of the West. And she was finally terrifyingly free. The initial intoxicating euphoria of her escape soon gave way to the harsh, sobering realities of her situation. The further Colette rode from the civilized, manicured world of her father's mansion, the more the untamed wilderness of Montana asserted its raw, indifferent dominance. The rolling foothills initially, a gentle undulation of golden grasses and scattered pines under a vast open sky, gradually steepened. Their slopes became more treacherous, their beauty taking on a menacing edge. The paths grew narrow and winding, littered with loose shale that skittered under Willow's hooves. Willow, her loyal and sure-footed companion, navigated the increasingly difficult terrain with a steady resolve that Colette envied. Her breath plumed in the crisp morning air, a rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic beating of Colette's heart. Colette, however, was beginning to feel the strain. The simple riding clothes that had seemed so practical in the warmth of her room now offered little protection against the biting, relentless wind that swept down from the high peaks. A gnawing, persistent hunger had begun to set in a hollow ache in her stomach that the small stash of dried beef and hardtack biscuits could only temporarily appease. Each bite was carefully rationed, a meager defense against a vast and growing emptiness. She pushed onward, driven by a primal, gut-wrenching fear of capture. She pictured her father's face not contorted with worry, but with cold, calculated rage. His pride had been wounded. But it was the image of Jedediah Kane that truly spurred her on, that gave her the strength to ignore the growing ache in her muscles and the gnawing anxiety in her heart. The thought of his leering face, his possessive gaze, his damp touch, it was a more terrifying prospect than any mountain predator. The first few days blurred into a monotonous, exhausting cycle of riding, resting in short, fretful bursts, and riding again. She followed a barely discernible game trail, a winding path that led her ever higher into the heart of the mountains. The air grew thinner, colder, each breath a sharp, icy sting in her lungs. The landscape transformed into a stark and unforgiving canvas of rock, snow, and ice. The majestic peaks that had once seemed a distant, beautiful symbol of hope now loomed over her like giant, indifferent sentinels, their snow-covered slopes a blinding, painful white in the harsh sunlight. The world was stripped of color, reduced to shades of white-gray and the deep, cold blue of the sky. On the fourth day, she stumbled upon a small, abandoned trapper's cabin, a crude log structure half swallowed by snowdrifts. A wave of relief washed over her. For a few hours, she had a solid roof over her head, a respite from the incessant wind. Inside, she found a small stack of firewood and a half-empty tin of coffee. As she huddled by a small, sputtering fire, sipping the bitter hot liquid, a dangerous sense of security settled over her. Perhaps she could rest here for a day, let her aching body recover. The sound of a distant rider shattered her brief illusion of safety. Peeking through a crack in the chinking, she saw a lone figure on horseback moving slowly along the valley floor below. It was too far to be certain, but the man's build, the set of his shoulders, was terrifyingly familiar. It could have been one of her father's ranch hands, or worse, one of Cain's men. Panic seized her. She quickly smothered the fire, the rising smoke, a potential beacon of her location. Grabbing her meager supplies, she burst from the cabin and scrambled to where Willow was hidden in a thicket of pines, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't wait to see if the rider would approach. The mere possibility was enough. The mountains were her only refuge. She pushed Willow harder now, the fear a fresh spur. The terrain became even more perilous. One afternoon, as she was navigating a particularly narrow and treacherous pass, a cornice of snow clinging precariously to the cliff edge above them, disaster struck. There was no warning, just a sudden violent gust of wind, a willy-war that seemed to come from nowhere, screaming down the mountainside with a deafening roar. The force of the wind was staggering, and it sent a shower of loose rocks and a cascade of heavy wet snow down the slope. Willow, startled by the sudden, terrifying onslaught, reared up in a panic, her whinny lost in the howl of the wind. Colette, caught completely off guard. Her hands, numb with cold, lost her grip on the reins and was thrown from the saddle. She landed hard on the rocky, uneven ground, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs and sending a blinding flash of white-hot pain through her body. A sharp, searing agony shot through her left ankle, and a wave of dizziness and nausea washed over her. Through a haze of pain, she pushed herself up onto her elbows and saw Willow. Her eyes wide with terror, scrambling for footing on the loose, shifting scree. The horse, in her frantic, desperate efforts to regain her balance, slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. Her leg twisted at a horrifying, unnatural angle. A sickening, sharp crack echoed through the suddenly silent air, a sound that would be seared into Colette's memory for the rest of her days. Willow let out a pained, guttural cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that tore at Colette's heart. She dragged herself towards her beloved mare, her own excruciating pain forgotten in the face of her companion's suffering. The horse's leg was grotesquely broken, a jagged shard of bone protruding from the skin, staining the pristine snow a dark, vibrant red. Tears streamed down Colette's face, freezing on her cheeks in the icy air. She knew with a certainty that felt like a physical blow that there was nothing she could do. In this wilderness, a broken leg was a death sentence. To leave her would be to condemn her to a slow, agonizing death from infection or predators. There was only one option, one final, terrible act of mercy she could offer her faithful friend. With a heavy broken heart and trembling hands, she reached for the hunting knife in her belt. The blade, which she had once seen as a symbol of her defiance and freedom, now felt like a cold, heavy instrument of betrayal. She crawled to Willow's head, stroking her soft muzzle, her voice choked with grief. "I'm so sorry." She whispered the words, lost in ragged sobs. "I'm so sorry, my friend. Thank you." She kissed the horse's forehead one last time. Then, with a single, swift, desperate motion, she ended her suffering. The silence that followed was absolute, a profound and empty stillness that was broken only by the sound of the wind and her own ragged, heartbroken sobs. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, stranded in the heart of the icy mountains with a badly injured ankle and no horse. Her meager supplies were scattered across the rocky ground, most of them lost in the fall, swallowed by the snow. The sun was beginning to dip below the jagged horizon, and the temperature was dropping with alarming speed. A sense of hopelessness, as cold and unforgiving as the surrounding peaks, began to seep into her bones, chilling her more than the wind ever could. As darkness fell, a deep, starless black, she huddled against a large boulder, trying to seek shelter from the biting wind. The pain in her ankle was a throbbing, relentless agony. The grief over Willow's death was a raw, open wound in her soul, and the fear of what lay ahead of the long, cold night was a suffocating weight on her chest. She was a fool to have thought she could conquer this wilderness. She was a pampered, naive girl who had traded a gilded cage for a frozen tomb. As she drifted into a restless, pain-filled and haunted sleep, she wondered if she would ever see the sunrise again. The first faint rays of dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in ethereal hues of pink and gold, a breathtaking spectacle of indifferent beauty that was entirely lost on Colette. She awoke to a world of pain and profound despair. Her ankle, now a grotesque, swollen mass of purple and blue, throbbed with a relentless, fiery agony. A deep, penetrating cold had seeped into her bones overnight, leaving her shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering in a ceaseless rhythm. The world seemed muted, her thoughts slow and thick, as if the cold was freezing her very mind. She knew she couldn't stay where she was. To remain was to surrender to the elements, to become another frozen, forgotten casualty of the unforgiving mountains. A spark of her earlier defiance, though dim and flickering, ignited within her. With a surge of desperate resolve, she tore a strip from her petticoat to bind her ankle tightly for support. Using her hunting knife, she sawed at a sturdy branch from a fallen pine until she had fashioned a crude crutch. The effort left her breathless and dizzy. Her first attempt to stand sent a wave of blackness across her vision, and she collapsed back into the snow with a cry of pain. She lay there for a long moment, the temptation to simply close her eyes and let go almost overwhelming. But the image of Jedediah Kane's triumphant face of her father's cold satisfaction pushed her to her feet again. She would not give them the satisfaction of her failure. She began to limp her way down the mountainside, her progress agonizingly slow. Every step was a fresh torment, a jarring shock that radiated up her leg. The landscape which had seemed so majestic from horseback was now a treacherous and unforgiving obstacle course. She stumbled over rocks, hidden beneath the snow, slid on treacherous patches of ice, and fell more times than she could count. Each fall was a new battle, a new test of her dwindling will to rise again. Her hands used to embroidery, and piano keys were raw, scraped, and bleeding from clawing at the frozen ground. Her fine riding clothes were torn and tattered, offering little defense against the piercing cold. Days bled into one another, a featureless blur of pain, gnawing hunger, and soul-crushing exhaustion. She lost track of time, her world shrinking to the next painful step, the next gasping breath. The vast silent wilderness seemed to mock her with its profound indifference. The sun, a distant and uncaring orb in the pale blue sky, offered little warmth. The nights were the worst, a waking torment of cold and fear, filled with the howls of unseen creatures and the relentless gnawing voice of her own despair. She was no longer Colette Caldwell, debutante of Three Forks. She was a wounded animal, driven by the most basic instinct, survive. She was on the verge of giving up, of finally succumbing to the sweet siren song of oblivion, of simply lying down in the snow and letting the cold claim her when she saw it. At first she thought it was a hallucination, a cruel trick of her exhausted mind. A thin, almost imperceptible wisp of smoke rising from a grove of trees in the valley far below. Hope, a feeling she had thought long dead and buried, flickered weakly back to life. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. It didn't matter who they were, trappers, miners, even outlaws. Anyone was better than the slow, lonely, freezing death she was facing. With a final desperate surge of determination, she pushed onward, her eyes fixed on that wisp of smoke, as if it were a beacon of salvation. It took her what felt like an eternity, the better part of a day, to reach the valley floor. Her body screamed in protest with every agonizing step, but her mind was locked on that single point of hope. As she drew closer, her heart hammering with a mixture of hope and trepidation, she saw a small temporary camp nestled in a sheltered clearing. A single crude lean-to fashioned from branches and animal hides stood beside a crackling fire. A string of freshly caught fish was smoking over the flames, and their rich, savory scent was a tantalizing, almost painful promise of food. But it was the man who stood by the fire that made her freeze her hand, tightening on her makeshift crutch. He was tall and broad-shouldered with long, raven-black hair that was braided with eagle feathers. His skin was the color of burnished copper, weathered by sun and wind. His face, stark and high-cheekboned, was a mask of stoic indifference. He was dressed in buckskin leggings and a heavy fur-lined tunic, and a quiver of arrows was slung across his back. A longbow rested against a nearby tree. He was a Native American, a warrior of the mountains, and he was watching her. Colette's heart, which had been buoyed by the prospect of rescue, now hammered against her ribs with a new, more potent kind of fear. She had grown up on stories about the tribes that roamed these mountains, lurid tales told by frightened settlers, stories of their ferocity, their savagery, their deep and abiding distrust of the white man. She had stumbled out of the frying pan and directly into the fire. The warrior said nothing. His dark, unreadable eyes followed her every move as she limped into the clearing, a pathetic, broken figure. He made no move to help her, no gesture of welcome or aggression. He simply stood there, a silent and imposing figure against the backdrop of the snow-covered mountains, as much a part of the landscape as the ancient pines themselves. Colette utterly exhausted, in excruciating pain, and with no other options knew she had to throw herself at his mercy. "Please," she croaked, her voice hoarse and cracked from disuse and dehydration. "I need help. My horse." "I fell." Her words came out as a pathetic whisper. The warrior remained silent, his gaze unwavering. It was an unnerving, assessing stare, as if he were studying a strange and unfamiliar creature that had wandered into his territory, trying to decide if it was a threat. Desperation gave her a surge of courage. She drew herself up, trying to inject some of her former strength into her voice. "My name is Colette Caldwell," she said more clearly this time. "I've been lost in these mountains for days. I need food and I think my ankle is broken." The warrior's expression did not change by so much as a flicker. He took a slow, deliberate step towards her. His movements were fluid and utterly silent, like those of a predator. He circled her slowly, his eyes taking in every detail of her pathetic state, her tattered, expensive clothes, her bleeding hands, her crudely splintered, swollen ankle. His gaze was clinical, detached. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body and see the intricate beadwork on his tunic. He reached out, and with a touch that was surprisingly gentle but undeniably firm, took her chin in his hand, tilting her face up to his. His eyes, which had seemed so cold and distant, now burned with a startling intensity that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. They were the darkest eyes she had ever seen, deep and ancient, holding secrets she could never hope to comprehend. "You are far from your people, little bird," he said. His voice was a low, guttural rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate, through her very bones. "And you have trespassed on the land of the Apsaya Luke." He released her chin and turned his back to her, a clear gesture of dismissal. Colette's fragile hope shattered. He was going to leave her here to die. But then he spoke again, his voice carrying a note of quiet, unassailable finality that chilled her to the core. "You are my captive." The warrior, whose name she later learned was Kael, was a man of profound silence, a silence as vast and impenetrable as the mountains he called home. He treated her not with the cruelty she had feared, but with a detached, almost clinical indifference that was in its own way more unnerving. He was not her host, nor was he her torturer. He was simply her keeper. He examined her ankle with practiced impersonal efficiency, then reset the bone with a swift, painful jerk that stole her breath. He fashioned new splints from stripped willow branches and applied a poultice of pungent dark green herbs that soon soothed the throbbing pain to a dull ache. He wordlessly handed her a portion of the smoked fish and a skin of fresh, cold water. These were not gestures of kindness, but of practicality. A dead captive, she reasoned, was of no use to him. Colette, for her part, was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Overwhelming gratitude for the food, the water, and the medical attention warred with a deep primal terror. She was a captive, a prisoner of a man whose people were renowned for their ferocity and their deep-seated and likely justified distrust of the white settlers who were relentlessly encroaching on their ancestral lands. She was completely at his mercy, a terrifying and humbling realization for a woman who had always been in one way or another protected. She watched Kael as he moved about the small Spartan camp. His every action was imbued with a quiet sense of purpose and a deep instinctual connection to the natural world around him. He moved with a silent grace and a contained power that was both captivating and deeply intimidating. He was a man who was completely at home in this harsh and unforgiving environment, a man who seemed to be as much a part of the landscape as the wind and the stone. Days passed, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun, and a strange unspoken routine developed between them. Kael would leave at dawn, disappearing into the woods with his bow, and return hours later with a rabbit, a grouse, or more fish. He taught her through gesture and the occasional curt word how to skin the animals and prepare the meat. While her ankle slowly, painstakingly healed, Colette tended the fire-fetched water from a nearby stream and kept their small camp tidy. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a sparse language of gestures and the occasional guttural command from Kael in his native tongue, which she slowly began to decipher. But in the long, silent evenings, as they sat on opposite sides of the crackling fire, the vast, star-studded sky stretching above them like a canopy of scattered diamonds, Colette found herself studying the warrior. Her initial paralyzing fear slowly began to give way to a grudging respect, and something more, something she hesitated to name. She saw the quiet, unyielding strength in his eyes, the deep lines etched on his face that spoke of a life of hardship and loss. She saw a man who was nothing like the one-dimensional savage of the stories she had been told. He was a proud and complex man, a protector of his people and his way of life. One evening, as a heavy snowstorm began to rage, blanketing their small shelter in a cocoon of white, the silence between them was broken by the distant, mournful howl of a wolf. Colette, startled by the lonely, eerie sound, let out a small gasp and drew her fur wrap tighter around her shoulders. Kael, who had been meticulously sharpening his hunting knife by the firelight, looked up at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "They are the spirits of our ancestors," he said, his voice a low, unexpected rumble. "They sing the songs of the hunt. They watch over us." It was the most he had said to her in one stretch since her capture. His words, spoken with such a simple, unwavering belief, seemed to open a small crack in the wall of silence that had separated them for so long. "Tell me about your people." Colette found herself saying, her voice barely a whisper, afraid to break the fragile spell. Kael was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the dancing flames. She thought he would ignore her retreating back into his fortress of silence. Then, to her profound surprise, he began to speak. He told her of the Apsaluke, the children of the large-beaked bird, a name given to them by their neighbors. He spoke of their long and proud history, of their deep reverence for the land and the creatures that inhabited it. He spoke not of savagery, but of a complex society with deep spiritual beliefs, of a world where everything, the rocks, the rivers, the animals, had a spirit. With a quiet, burning anger, he spoke of the changes brought by her people, the iron horse that scarred their sacred hunting grounds, the talking wires that hummed with the messages of the white man of the treaties that had been made with eloquent words and broken with casual disregard. As he spoke, Colette saw not a captor, but a man desperately fighting to preserve a world that was slipping through his fingers. She saw the deep pain and the simmering anger in his eyes, but also a fierce and unwavering determination to protect his people, to honor the ways of his ancestors. He spoke of his own family, of a wife and young son lost to the white man's coughing sickness, 2 winters past, a tragedy that had carved the permanent lines of grief into his face. In that moment, something profound shifted between them. The chasm of culture and prejudice that had separated them began to narrow. Colette, the pampered daughter of a wealthy landowner, and Kael, the grieving, fierce warrior of a proud and ancient tribe, found a fragile common ground in their shared humanity, in their mutual struggle for survival in a world fraught with danger and uncertainty. Her captivity, which had begun as a terrifying ordeal, was slowly, imperceptibly transforming into something else, something she could not yet define. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a witness to a world on the verge of disappearing, a world of profound beauty and deep spiritual significance. And she was beginning to realize with a sense of wonder and trepidation that the man who held her captive might also be the one who could teach her the true meaning of freedom. The arrival of the war party was as sudden and as violent as the mountain storms Kyle had taught her to respect. They descended upon the small camp at dawn, their painted faces a grotesque mask of fury. Their war cries a chilling symphony of hatred that echoed through the silent valley. They were from a rival tribe. The Blackfeet, their animosity towards the Apsaalooke, a bitter and long-standing feud exacerbated by the shrinking hunting grounds and the pressures of the encroaching white world. Kyle alerted by the faintest sound, the snap of a twig. The barest whisper on the wind was on his feet in an instant. He moved from sleep to full deadly alertness in a single fluid motion. His bow was in his hand, his eyes blazing with a warrior's fury. He shoved Colette behind the meager protection of a large boulder, a protective gesture that was as instinctual as breathing. "Stay down," he commanded, the words sharp and urgent. The battle was a whirlwind of brutal, chaotic violence. The Blackfeet warriors, their faces contorted with a bloodthirsty rage, swarmed into the clearing, their tomahawks and war clubs flashing in the cold morning light. Kyle met them with a ferocity that was both terrifying and magnificent. He moved with a deadly efficient grace, his arrows finding their mark with an unerring accuracy. His hunting knife became a blur of motion as he engaged in the brutal, intimate dance of hand-to-hand combat. Colette watched, her heart lodged in her throat, a horrified fascination warring with her terror. She saw Kyle take down one warrior, then another, his movements a symphony of controlled, lethal violence, but he was outnumbered 4-1. For every enemy he felled, another seemed to take his place. She saw him falter. A thrown tomahawk meant for his head grazed his shoulder, opening a deep gash that sent a spray of dark blood onto the pristine snow. He stumbled, and in that split second of vulnerability, 2 Blackfeet warriors were on him, their faces alight with triumphant savagery. A primal scream, raw and animalistic, tore from Colette's throat. She was no warrior. She was no match for these hardened killers. But she could not stand by and watch Kyle be slaughtered. In a surge of adrenaline-fueled courage that surprised even herself, she grabbed a heavy burning log from the fire pit. Ignoring the searing pain as the hot wood burned her hands, she charged into the fray. She swung the log with all her might, striking one of the warriors across the back of his knees. He buckled with a cry of surprise and pain, giving Kyle the opening he desperately needed. Kyle drove his knife into the man's side, then spun to face the other, his eyes blazing with a renewed, desperate fury. The battle raged on, a desperate, bloody struggle for survival. Colette, armed with her smoldering makeshift weapon, fought with a ferocity she never knew she possessed. She was no longer Colette Caldwell, the delicate lady. She was a she-bear, a cornered animal fighting for her life and for the life of the man who had, against all odds, become her protector. And then, just as it seemed they were about to be overwhelmed by the remaining 2 warriors, a new sound filled the air. The thunder of hoofbeats and the piercing, familiar war cries of the Apsa'aluka. A party of Kael's own warriors, led by his younger brother Chaitan, had arrived drawn by the sounds of battle. The tide of the battle turned in an instant. The Blackfeet, now hopelessly outmatched, broke and fled their retreat as swift and as chaotic as their attack, disappearing like vengeful ghosts back into the forest. The clearing was left in a state of carnage, the snow stained with the blood of the fallen, the air thick with the smell of smoke and death. Kael, his body battered and bleeding from several wounds, stood tall amidst the chaos, his chest heaving. His eyes scanned the scene with a grim satisfaction. He then looked at Colette. She stood panting, her face smudged with soot and blood. Her dress torn her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, fear, and wild exhilaration. A slow, incredulous smile touched his lips, a rare and beautiful thing that transformed his harsh, grief-worn features. "You fight like a she-bear protecting her cub's little bird," he said, his voice filled with a newfound, profound respect. In that moment, as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a golden, sanctifying light on the snow-covered clearing, Colette knew that her life had been irrevocably and completely changed. She was no longer a captive. She was a survivor. And she had found a home and a family in the most unlikely of places, in the fierce, untamed heart of the wild American West. The aftermath of the battle was a somber and brutal affair. The Apsa'aluka warriors, their faces grim and set, moved with a quiet, practiced purpose. They tended to their wounded, including Kael, whose shoulder wound was deep, and they mourned their dead. 2 warriors had fallen in the initial chaotic moments of the fight. Colette, her own adrenaline-fueled courage having long since faded, felt a profound sense of shock and sorrow as she looked upon the carnage. This was the raw, unvarnished reality of the world she had entered. A world where life and death were separated by the thinnest of margins, by a moment's hesitation or a stroke of luck. Kael, his shoulder tightly bound with clean bandages provided by his brother, moved among his warriors with a quiet authority. His presence, even in his wounded state, was a source of strength and reassurance. He spoke to them in their native tongue, his voice a low and steady murmur that seemed to calm their frayed nerves and honor their shared grief. Chaitan, Kael's younger brother, approached Colette. He was younger than Kael, his face less weathered by the harsh realities of their world, but he possessed the same quiet strength, the same deep, intelligent eyes. He looked at her not as a captive or an outsider, but with a mixture of curiosity and open respect. "You fought with the heart of a warrior little bird," he said, using the same affectionate name Kael had given her. It sounded different from him, less a term of possession, more one of kinship. "My brother was right to see the strength in you. The story of the white woman who fought with a burning log will be told around our fires." His words, spoken with a simple, unadorned sincerity, touched Colette in a way that the flowery, empty compliments of her former life never could. Here she had been judged not by her beauty or her family name, but by her courage, her willingness to stand and fight in the face of overwhelming odds. The journey to the main Apsa'aluk village took 3 days. Colette rode one of the spare horses, her healing ankle still too weak for extended walking. As they traveled, she found herself being drawn deeper into their world. She listened as the warriors spoke, her ear slowly attuning to the rhythms of their language. Chaitan, more talkative than his brother, often rode beside her, pointing out landmarks and telling her their Apsa'aluk names, sharing stories of hunts and spirits that were tied to the very rocks and rivers they passed. She saw a world alive with meaning and history, a stark contrast to the way her father and men like him saw the land as something to be claimed, measured, and exploited. The Apsara village was a sprawling encampment of painted teepees nestled in a sheltered, sun-drenched valley. It was a vibrant and bustling community that pulsed with the rhythms of daily life. The air was filled with the sounds of children laughing, dogs barking, and the steady thud of women tanning hides. As their party rode in a wave of curiosity rippled through the village, Colette was met with hundreds of eyes, some suspicious, some curious, a few openly hostile. Her pale skin and her strange, tattered clothes were a stark contrast to the burnished copper skin and the buckskin and beadwork of the villagers. She was an anomaly, an outsider. But Kael now returned to his people as a respected war chief vouched for her. That evening at a council fire with the tribe's elders, he told the full story. He spoke of finding her a bird with a broken wing, alone and dying in the mountains. He recounted her weeks as his captive, her quiet resilience, and her growing respect for their ways. And finally, with a voice filled with pride, he described her courage in the face of the Blackfeet attack. He held up the singed sleeve of his tunic. She did this not for herself, but for one of us. Her heart is strong. His words, spoken with a quiet authority that commanded the respect of his people, were enough. The suspicion in the eyes of the elders softened, replaced by a grudging acceptance. Colette was given her own teepee, a small but comfortable dwelling that she soon made her own. The women of the tribe, initially wary, began to open up to her. An elderly woman named Meadowlark, whose eyes held the wisdom of many winters, took Colette under her wing. She taught her their skills, their crafts, their language. Colette learned to tan hides until they were soft as butter, to bead intricate symbolic patterns onto moccasins, to cook the traditional foods of the Apsara over an open fire. She learned the names of the healing plants, the rhythms of the seasons, the secrets of the land that had nearly claimed her life. She found a sense of purpose and belonging that she had never known in the suffocating drawing rooms of her father's world. Here her worth was measured by what she could contribute, by the strength of her character, not the size of her dowry. She was no longer a pawn in a rich man's game, a bird in a gilded cage. She was a member of a community, a contributor to the well-being of the tribe. She was home. Months passed. The deep snows of winter gave way to the vibrant green of spring. Then one day, a rider arrived in the village, a white man, a trader who sometimes acted as a messenger. He brought a letter for Colette, a letter that had been circulating through the territory's forts and trading posts for months. It was from her father. Her heart pounded in her chest as she broke the wax seal, her hands trembling. Her father's familiar, elegant script seemed alien in this new world. His words were a chaotic mixture of anger, relief, and a desperate plea for her to return. He wrote of his shame of the scandal her disappearance had caused. He wrote of Jedediah Kane's consuming fury, of the bounty he had placed on her head, a fortune for her return, no questions asked. The letter ended with a plea that tore at her heart. Your mother fades without you. Come home, and all will be forgiven. The letter was a stark, painful reminder of the world she had left behind. A world of wealth and privilege, but also of suffocating expectations and a loveless, terrifying future. She looked up from the page at the painted teepees, at the children playing by the river, at the majestic, snow-capped mountains that had once been her prison and were now her sanctuary. She knew what she had to do. With a steady hand and a clear heart, She took a piece of charcoal and a strip of smoothed birch bark the trader had given her. She penned a reply to her father. She told him that she was safe, that she was happy, that she had found a new life, a new home, and a new family. She wrote of her mother with love and sorrow, but she knew returning would not save her. It would only condemn them both. She ended the letter with a simple final declaration. I am not the daughter you lost. I am a woman who has found herself. I am not coming back. She gave the letter to the trader and watched him ride away a lone figure against the vast, empty landscape. As he disappeared over the horizon, she felt a profound sense of peace, a sense of final, absolute closure. She had finally and completely severed the ties to her past. She turned and saw Kael standing by the entrance to her teepee. He was watching her, his dark eyes filled with a quiet, profound understanding. He had not asked her what was in the letter, had not questioned her decision. He had simply been there, a silent and steady presence, a man who had come to know her heart as well as he knew his own. He walked towards her, his movements fluid and graceful. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the valley, bathing him in a warm, ethereal light. He took her hand in his touch no longer that of a captor, but of a partner. It was gentle, yet firm, a promise of strength and safety. You are one of us now, little bird, he said, his voice a low and intimate rumble that resonated deep within her soul. Your path is here with us. She looked up at him into his dark, intense eyes and saw not a fierce warrior, not a captor, but a man who had seen the strength in her when she could not see it herself. He was the man who had given her a new life, a new hope, a new love. I know, she said, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable joy. I am home. In the heart of the wild and untamed West, a woman who had fled a gilded cage, who had been captured by a fierce warrior, had found her true destiny. She had found her freedom. She had found her home. And she had found her heart. Colette's journey from a gilded cage to the heart of the untamed West is a testament to the indomitable spirit of a woman who dared to defy convention and forge her own path. It's a story of survival of love and of the transformative power of embracing a world that is vastly different from our own. But her story doesn't end here. The shadows of her past in the form of a wealthy, obsessed suitor and a father who will not forget still loom on the horizon. The world of the Apsaalluke is itself threatened by the relentless march of a nation. What challenges will she and Kael face together? How will their two worlds continue to collide? If you were captivated by Colette's story, if you felt the chill of the icy mountains and the warmth of the Apsaalluke fire, then please show your support. Hit that like button. Share this video with your friends, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage, adventure, and the untamed human spirit. Your support allows us to continue bringing these stories to life. Let us know in the comments below what you think will happen next for Colette and Kael.